So just a quick funny about our next speaker is I asked about 10 people how to pronounce her last name. Every single person pronounced it the way I would have, and then everybody said, I know that's not correct. So the girl that's talking here is from a town that we say Quarter, which has water. We drive on a highway that is called really 44, but everybody calls it 44, especially if you're over 70. And I went to a school called Washington University here in town. Yes, you heard the R, everyone says it from St. Louis. So I am going to do my best to announce my speaker's last name. She told me I didn't have to, I could call her Amy J, but I'm gonna try. So our second speaker is Amy Jeanguenat. Okay, thank you. I'm gonna drive home what's still on 44. Amy comes from a career forged in DNA forensic science, and we all know the stressors that go along with that. A former laboratory director and technical leader, her leadership and management styles evolved in response to the demands of running a high-throughput lab. We all know that, right? In 2016, she launched MyGen in efforts to develop best practices for forensic science and provide tools for management and employees on how to manage stress, resulting in a better quality of life. This sounds like a great speech for all of us type A. I am lucky to not have a boss that is type A, so we are like yin and yang, and she tries to keep me stress-free, but I want to hear it.
Thank you. So I worked on this abstract with David Canaris, who's the assistant chief of the Alaska State Crime Laboratory, and I know he really wanted to be here for this meeting, but had a personal conflict. I became interested in this topic and launched an initiative a couple years ago called the Mindful Forensics Initiative, which has 3 overall goals. One is to provide awareness to the field and education and understanding that we have industry-specific stress and pressures and vicarious trauma. The second is to be a resource, to help provide training in resilience techniques and in mindfulness, to give people personal coping skills, but to also start to work with organizations on how can we address these differently at an organizational level, and even in our field, what can we do systematically. And I'm trying to learn from these different experiences to be able to evolve the field in this area. I'm really interested in looking at people holistically, because I think as we're approaching this, we're tending to look at what are the work things that affect us, but our work, I'm sure you might relate, can affect our personal life, and our personal life can affect our work, because we're people, we're not these 2 separate entities, so I'm also interested in holistic approaches to this. Dave and I were introduced about a year ago, and the genesis of it was a paper that I co-authored in the Journal of Forensic Science, which was just an awareness piece to get us talking about what are the pressures that we might experience that are different than other industries. Some of the topics were the exposure to horrific events, whether that's experiencing it through crime scenes, through digital imagery, through having to read medical reports or police reports, and that can have effect on our moral injury, because we are expecting the world on some level to be okay, and it really is, but when you're seeing all that bad stuff all the time, it can skew your worldview and your behavior. Also working within the adversarial system, and I think Karen did a great job to set me up for why that can be quite difficult, and especially this idea that we should be error-free, and we're human, so how can we deal with that on a more positive basis? Also, the environment in which we work. I know a lot of civilians that go to crime scenes have said they don't always feel safe. The bad guy might still be out there somewhere, and the person that they have watching the crime scene is sleeping in his car. There's also things in the lab, like drug exposure or exposure to bloodborne pathogens. And then case volume, of course, is knocking us all down. There's just so much work to do. I don't know if that's necessarily specific to our industry. I think a lot of people are overworked and have things going on, but I know not knowing the outcome of cases can sort of affect your satisfaction out of the job. So Dave and I started talking about these issues, and he said, I really recognize how they've affected me. I see how they've affected my staff, And we are going to be having an emotional intelligence training, and I have no idea what to expect, and how can I use that to shift our culture? I was like, okay, well, I have some predictions about what it'll do. I think you'll find the majority of your staff are going to get something out of it. They'll take away something positive. You're going to have a few people that this really resonates with, and they're going to go out there and take the information and run with it. And then you're going to have your kicking and screaming people who don't want to be there, and this isn't for them, as sort of this overarching. And I said, nothing is going to happen if you just have a workshop and then expect your people to change based on the information they learned. So are you dedicated to changing your culture in your lab? And are you supported by your lab management and your staff? And he said, yeah, I think we're at that place. So we're like, great, let's see how we can begin to shift the culture at the laboratory. So a little bit about the Alaska State Crime Laboratory. They are 37 employees when fully staffed, and they service the entire state of Alaska, including all of the remote areas that they might have to go to for testimony or for crime scene. Their forensics section is split up into 3 main sections that handles biology, physical, and chemistry. And they're supported by admin staff, evidence, and management. So for this particular training, it was a mandatory training for their laboratory, but we wanted to do an evaluation around the training, and we had 28 people that volunteered to participate in the evaluation. To assess the training program, and we wanted to determine where could they develop their wellness and well-being program from this, the volunteers were issued a professional quality of life survey. This is a survey that was developed to look at the quality of life in people who work in crisis situations, whether that's at an individual level, community level, national, or international level. And it's been applied a lot in therapy, for example. And then the particular training program, Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute, they had their own assessment questions, so we issued those beforehand as well to see if we could come up with any trends. The training that took place was 2 live days, followed by a 28-day challenge where the staff were trying to implement some of the things that they learned from the workshop. And then following that challenge, they again were assessed with the ProQual survey and the Search Inside Yourself survey. So mindfulness-based emotional intelligence has really been touted to expand leadership, and even Harvard has said can be more important than your IQ when being a leader. And if you're thinking, I don't know how much attuned I am to my emotions, the emotions of others, these are learned skills. So that's one thing we got going for us. This can also be shown to improve collaboration and performance, and when combined with mindfulness, can also enhance well-being and resilience. The Search Inside Yourself program is based on 6 pillars, and if you read the book, Search Inside Yourself, you'll kind of get a feel for what the workshop was like. But the first 5 pillars are from Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence. So self-awareness is your ability to be in tune to your internal states. Self-management is being able to recognize and control your impulses and your reactions. Motivation is being aware of what are the tendencies that you need to reach your goals. Empathy is being able to relate to others, especially in the time of suffering. Leadership is the ability to produce results in others that are desirable. And mindfulness is the ability to train focus attention. The Search Inside Yourself assessment looked at 4 areas, and I'm just giving an example question from each due to time, but there were multiple questions that were asked in these areas. So for example, stress. I experienced tension in my body due to stress, and there was a scale in which the participants rated that. Performance. I feel I can bounce back quickly from challenges. Focus. I notice when I'm distracted and can return to the present moment. And leadership. I am able to pause before reacting. The Professional Quality of Life survey looked at 3 areas: compassion satisfaction, the pleasure that we derive from our work, burnout, feelings of hopelessness or difficulties in being able to do an effective job, and secondary traumatic stress, when we have secondary exposure to traumatic events that are work-related. And again, this wasn't done out of research. This was done as a way to evaluate the training program and to make recommendations to the laboratory on what they could do next. Some of the example questions, and again, there were multiple questions in each area that were scaled. Compassion satisfaction. I believe I can make a difference in my work. Burnout. I am not as productive at work because I am losing sleep over traumatic experiences I encounter in casework. Secondary traumatic stress. I avoid certain activities or situations because they remind me of frightening experiences of the people I encounter in casework. So, not completely surprised, there were no statistical significant changes before or after the workshop to any of these questions. So let's put that into perspective. So you send a couple people to a workshop to learn a technical skill. Come back to the laboratory and decide you're going to implement this new technology. You invest in equipment, you invest in space. You then perform a validation to determine how that works and what needs to be improved. You write standard operating procedures, you train your staff, you go out and tell your stakeholders, and you might have to go back and make modifications. And we can't treat professional development any differently. It takes that kind of care to bring it into your laboratory. And I think Alaska is there in what they want to do. But we can't expect it to have this fast approach or to take a pill and fix everything. But what came out of this were some trends. And these are trends that the laboratory is looking to work off of. There were positive swings in well-being, in habit building, and also communication. Overall, some of the trends that came out of professional quality of life for compassion satisfaction, the participants were basically a bell curve. The majority of people fell in the middle. Some received a lot of satisfaction based on the work they did, and some, their satisfaction came from things other than work. The group had a slightly higher risk for burnout. About 30% of the people fell in that category. And for secondary traumatic stress, we may have identified a population that is at risk. It's about 70% of the participants fell on a higher end spectrum for feelings of overwhelm. So it doesn't mean they're necessarily experiencing secondary traumatic stress, but they are at risk for it. And again, this is not meant to be diagnostic, but how can we use this information to improve their program? So in the areas of stress and well-being, there was a 21% decrease in both the ability to let go of negative thoughts and also feelings of being emotionally drained because of work. In positive habit building, 68% of the participants established some sort of mindfulness practice following the training. And I think that's pretty good because habit building is very difficult. But to put it in perspective, they weren't necessarily doing that every day. Some did it once or twice a week, some did it 3 or 4 times a week. And for their practice, 48% of them practiced at least 11 minutes per week, either walking, breathing, or doing some type of sitting meditation. And these were all techniques to help build resilience. Both anecdotally and in some of the data, there was a big improvement in communication across their forensic teams. Going through this workshop together, they found that they were really talking to each other and they were bonding over what they were sharing, and that they hadn't really had that experience before in their lab. 27% of the participants said that they were better able to engage in active listening following the training. There was a big component on mindful communication and really trying to listen to each other before you come up with how you're going to respond. And 31% of the people felt more connected to others. So there were some challenges that were noted. For the 28-day challenge, The participants could choose anything they wanted to do to work on. And I think that's great for one perspective because you want people to have variety and choose things that work for them. But the pros and cons weren't necessarily addressed. And obviously it's hard to evaluate if people are doing things differently. But they learned a lot of practices over the course of the couple days. Some of them were what you would put into a category of a dedicated practice, which means that you actually set aside time to do it. And that is really where the research shows, where you begin to change your brain and your body in relationship to how you deal with stress and pressure. I don't think that was adequately explained to the staff. So that wasn't necessarily a requirement. Not everybody chose to do a dedicated practice as their challenge. Some chose a micro or integrated practice, which are practices that are done in the moments when you feel that you are under stress or pressure. And these are great because they can help diffuse situations, but there really isn't a lot of data to support that it can have a long-term effect. And I also think it's harder to implement if you've never done it and you're not doing a dedicated practice, which sets you up for being aware and being able to be more responsive in the moment. That, oh, hey, I feel these physical changes in my body, or I notice what's going on. I don't want to react in a certain way. I want to respond in this way. It takes a little while to get off autopilot when you're used to being on it. Another challenge was the entire pillar of empathy. And if you're like, I don't know the difference between empathy, sympathy, compassion, they tend to all get blurred together. Empathy is really your ability to relate to others' feelings and perspectives, and especially when other people are suffering. Where this kind of got lost on the group was just the way that it was taught, in that potentially the people that were there said, you should be empathetic towards your victims. And that just kind of set off this whole well, is that going to distort my judgment? Am I going to be biased if I'm, thinking about the victim? Oh, and also I think that could cause me distress if I'm paying, too much attention to these scenarios and trying to relate to my victims on such a level as empathy. So what took place shortly after the training? And to put this into perspective, the training took place over just last August and September, so this is all pretty new as far as what's being introduced. The laboratory created a wellness committee, and their primary focus is to promote happiness and well-being in the laboratory, but to really look at the staff and help prioritize what are the changes that we want to make well-being our number one priority. Some things that they're doing now is looking at their onboarding process and trying to prioritize what are the cultural areas of improvement that are important to their staff. As a result of the professional quality of life training and also how the staff reacted to empathy, they received specific training in vicarious trauma. This wasn't necessarily a topic that was brought up over the course of the 2-day training, but it was definitely a need that came out and that was recognized, and that helped to build on the unique industry issues that were uncovered. The staff also completed an engagement survey, which was created by the Wellness Committee, to try to identify what were the areas that they could improve in. Some of the feedback from that was that 93.5% of their staff were happy working there. Other general trends were that they felt the laboratory was moving in the right direction. They noticed that their management and that their lab staff was listening to them and taking into consideration the feedback that they had, and they saw them implementing what they requested. Others were that they really appreciated the Wellness Committee and what that staff was doing, and that they can really tell that especially Dave is leading by example, and that he wants this to work, and he is trying the best he can to start to move his lab in the right direction, knowing that it's going to take years, not just 4 weeks. So some of the things that came out of this, if you're training forensic professionals, is that this did begin to lay a foundation to shift the culture. They have a place to start with. They have some tools that they can use towards moving to a more engaged workforce. Both the management staff there And I kind of support and believe that when you take care of your people, it's a natural extension to do the other things you need to get done. Productivity is better, quality is better, efficiency. And they think some of the changes they want to make in that to lay the foundation first and making sure their people are in a good place is going to make that a lot easier. Recommendations for training forensic professionals. One is to know the industry. The program they received was generic, and it's great, it's fantastic if you ever have the chance to go through it. But not being able to address these industry pressures or knowing about vicarious trauma and be able to speak and talk to it, I think was a miss. I also think it's important to prime your employees. This was a mandatory training, and some people had to go kicking and screaming. And I think if they had a little bit more information going into it about what it was going to be like, what they could expect, it might have helped ease them a little bit more. And also to have your cultivation that you're trying to do based in research. And this would go back to that dedicated practice that not everybody partaked in, and it's showing the importance of how to build a positive habit and what's the importance of having these dedicated activities. And then again, to be able to introduce the vicarious trauma concept. So if you have any questions about mindful forensics, or you're interested in continuing this conversation, please don't hesitate to contact me. I will also be here through Thursday. And David would also love to hear any feedback or suggestions that you have as he begins this process, and he can tell you what's been working and what's not working. He would take any emails as well. Thank you.